Forge, page 46, before. Isabel wore the ribbon around her wrist. She collected the seeds and kept them in a small bag made of wax sailcloth. The seeds came from her home in Rhode Island, the garden behind the house that she worked in New York, and a different New Jersey field near last winter's Army's encampment. We stayed near that camp and found work. Isabel repaired soldiers' clothes for a seamstress, and I was hired by a cuss-mouthed blacksmith who paid me poorly to keep his forge burning. We had started out as friends, Isabel and me, but grew to be more like brother and sister, mocking, arguing, and occasionally tormenting each other. I teased her about being a country bumpkin, and she calls me curse on because it irritated me, and and tried to get me to explain the meaning behind my name, which of course I refused to because of my father's advice. I did not like her to walk alone in the dark. She did not like me telling her what to do. Everything changed one day in April when told a funny story about the blacksmith that made her laugh. The sound of it and the sight of her smile caused my heart to gallop and my throat to close up so that I could not speak. And suddenly I realized that I did not want her to regard me as her brother anymore. Of course, I did not tell her that. Forge, Chapter 10. In those first days, I did not regret enlisting. The army fed me regular. I had blankets, boots, and a musket. Sleeping with 5 fellows in a small tent was a bit of a challenge on account of the snores and farts, but at least I was warm enough. Most of the wagering around the campfire centered on how long the war would last. Eben thought we'd be free of duty by November. Others said Christmas. One fellow in our tent, a fusspot old tailor with watery eyes named Civilness, said we'd be in service for years. He was not well liked. Uncle Sergeant, I thought of him in that manner, though I was careful never to address him as so, teamed me with Eben and posted us to the river guard to keep watch for any British boats. We saw snapping turtles, hawks, and paw prints of a large bear, and countless leaves swirled to the ground. The only redcoats we saw were deserters approaching with their hands in the air. The British were trapped and hungry. They had no supplies. They could not survive the march north to Canada. To the east lay the New Hampshire grants bristling with patriots. To the west stretched wilderness and certain death. Our army waited in the south, ready to finish the job started on the battlefield. More than a week after the battle, General Burgoyne finally agreed to surrender. Messengers rode back and forth between the two camps, always with a white flag flying so no one would shoot at them, and arrangements were made so that the American army could accept all of Burgoyne's soldiers and prisoners. Our days guarding the river ended. I bet the turtles were grateful. The officers ordered all the Continentals and militiamen to line up both sides of the road for an official surrender. The day was cool and damp, with dark clouds to the north that Eben said were heavy with snow. He liked to pretend he knew all there was about weather, so I figured we were in for a stretch of sunshine. While we waited, I piled stones next to my boots. I had a handful of acorns in my right pocket, too. Eben was vexing questions about my weapons, but I didn't answer. Eventually, he gave up and dove into a story about his mother's uncle's cow that gave birth to a calf with 2 heads. One was the head of a goat and the other a cat, a terrible omen, he said, that foretold the fire that burned in the old man's barn and the fox that killed all of his chickens. I rolled my right boot back and forth over a stone that was round as a wicket ball. Near a year earlier, I had been with the American troops who were captured by the British at Fort Washington. They marched all 2,000 of us down the Greenwich Road to New York City, where a crowd of lobsterbacks and Tories threw eggs and rotten garbage at us, screaming curses, foul names, and insults. We had no firewood in the prison, no glass in the windows. They fed us spoiled meat and moldy biscuits, and when they remembered to feed us at all. Within weeks, hundreds of men had died of cold and pestilent fevers. If Isabel hadn't stolen me out of there, I'd be long dead too. I gave my ear a hard tug to force all the memories of Isabel to retreat. As the British marched by in defeat, I aimed to pay them back for the treatment of me. Pity that I had not thought to bring a bucket of horse dung. Distant drums began to beat. Our regimental drummers picked up the call and rattled their instruments like an approaching thunder. "Here they come!" someone hollered. Our fifers burst into song, playing Yankee Doodle to insult the enemy. We all stood straight, muskets at our sides, forming a patriot gauntlet stretching as far as the eye could see. The lobsterbacks came first, their regimental flags fluttering weakly. Their arms swung freely, for they had surrendered their guns before this enforced parade. Many of the arms were bandaged, and the famous redcoats torn in their flight through the wilderness. Their breeches were more mud-stained than they were white. Nearly every man had lost buttons from his coat. I stuck my hand in my pocket and gripped the fat acorn. I would not throw the first one, for that would bring too much attention to myself, but as soon as the throwing started, I joined in the fray with pleasure. The British passed us by row. On the whole, they were shorter than we were, and mostly man-aged. Their uniforms, though dirty, made them look to be a proper army. They moved as one body with thousands of arms and legs. We looked like what we were, an army of farmers and poor craftsmen. Some of the rebels, white-haired grandsires, and we had younger boys than me, with no hint of whiskers or manhood upon them. Our fellows of the middle years came from New England, New Jersey, New York, Virginia, Pennsylvania, fishermen, farmers, cobblers, preachers, school teachers, woodsmen, and every other job under the sun. We conversated and joked mostly in English, but some spoke in languages from over the ocean, and others in speech of those mountains. One for Oneida, Stockbridge, Tuscarora, and the Narragansett warriors stood with us. We wore all manners of shirts, waistcoats, breeches, and shoes, though some were barefooted. Looking down our lines, I saw every possible color of hair and eye, though some were missing an eye, and others were bald-headed, as well as all colors of skin, from the darkest of black of men born in Africa to the snow-white pallor of Scottishmen, and all shades betwixt the two. The appearance of our army recalled the variations of the trees and the leaves in the forest behind us. Each soldier stood tall, each soul afire with pride. No one threw a thing. They didn't shout insults or mock the captains. Even Eben's mouth was closed. "Why is no one jeering?" I whispered. "We should shame them." Uncle said we must give them honor. This is the first time the British Army has surrendered, ever. I tightened my fist of acorns. They had not honored us in the prison at New York. Was not the point of war to beat the enemy, to make them feel the pain of losing? The drums and fifes ceased. Our ranks stood silent as the walls of granite. The enemy continued to march, their boots shuffling along the dirt road. After the British came the Hessians, Germans who fought on the British side for money. Most of them wore green uniforms and some blue. All were filthy, but they curled their mustaches and were combed neat. After the Hessians came their women and a few children and a handful of soldiers leading the animals that had become German pets, raccoons, fawns, and two bear cubs. We stood for hours all that afternoon as our 6,000 prisoners paraded between our lines in defeat. I did not understand why, but I chose the course of honor. I stood soldier to soldier with the other patriots in a powerful silence. When all the prisoners had marched down to the clearing where they would be guarded until they were escorted to Boston, I took myself down to the river. The turtles were all hiding, so I threw my weapons at the last of the sun on the water.